This is WCNY's The Capitol Press Room, and we're joined in the studio by Anna Hall, CEO for the New York State Charter Association, which represents more than 350 public charter schools serving nearly 200,000 kids across the Empire State, and is lobbying for more funding support from the state. Thanks for making the time, Anna.
Happy to be here.
So, for starters, what exactly constitutes a quote-unquote public charter school, and generally speaking, what kids do you end up serving?
So charter schools in New York, as you said, are public. A group of community organizations or citizens can get together and pursue a charter from one of two chartering entities in New York, either SUNY Charter Schools Institute or the State Education Department. And they're issued a charter, an actual physical piece of paper, if anyone's ever interested to see, that gives them the authority to operate a school.
And in terms of the population that you serve, is this just a cross-section of kids? Because we often hear this perception, maybe it's a myth, maybe it's reality, that charter schools are picking the kids they want, and they're grabbing the best kids for sports or academics and leaving all the problem kids behind in the public schools.
So in New York, charter schools have to demonstrate as part of their charter application process their intent to serve at-risk students. And that can be defined in a variety of different ways, but in practice, that means, generally speaking, charter student populations are more at risk even than in their host district. Usually that means students with higher low-income percentages and low-income and minority students.
And that word public, does that mean these are funded with public dollars, or does that just speak to the doors are open for kids around the area and we're funded with private dollars?
Both. Both in the sense of they're funded with public dollars and the doors are open for kids across the area. And those public dollars are a combination of state and local funds, just like district schools.
And in terms of the amount of money you get, how is that calculated? Are you somewhere in the foundation aid formula that I just haven't seen? Is there a specific line for charter schools, or do you just show up to the local boards of education with, your Oliver Twist impersonation? Please, sir, I want some more money, please.
Well, as much as that sometimes feels like it is the case, there is a specific funding formula for charter schools, which actually predates the foundation aid formula. And it is a tricky and wonky feature of New York education funding right now, in particular with all of the conversations that are going around foundation aid, that the charter funding formula is separate and distinct from foundation aid.
Well, foundation aid, which is the way the bulk of the state's education dollars are distributed, is based on this idea of need primarily. How is your formula determined?
The charter funding formula right now is, and I'm oversimplifying here,
Please.
Essentially is a rolling 3-year average of the changes in a district's approved operating expense. So it's an attempt to basically ensure that as a district, and generally speaking, the expectation is that a district spending will increase, although in some cases that's not the case, and that has negative implications for charter funding. But it's essentially trying to tie charter funding to the spending decisions and behavior by the district. Because, as you said, foundation aid is the mechanism that's driving state resources to districts. But then every district in the state, even the ones that receive the highest percentage of foundation aid as part of their budget, are also leveraging local resources for their spending. So the charter formula is an attempt to capture not just state funding, but also the local funding in order to try to approximate the spending decisions and behavior of districts.
And how has the status quo worked for your 350 plus members?
It's a real mix. So some things you didn't hear me say that the charter funding formula has, there's no hold harmless. And the changes in increases or decreases can vary incredibly widely. So very challenging for public institutions like any education institution to plan, to budget, when increases or even decreases can change a lot from year to year. And I think the one other thing that I would say that has been an unfortunate and potentially unforeseen consequence of these two funding formulas is that the experience of districts is that they are writing checks to charter schools. So even though it's public funds that are flowing into the district from the state and from the locality, the district's experience is that charter schools cost them money, which I think has really exacerbated some of the us versus them dynamics that are going on between districts and charters. Very, very unfortunately, I believe.
Well, during the legislative budget hearing on the education portion of the governor's budget proposal, the Assembly Ways and Means Committee Chair Gary Pretlow, a Yonkers Democrat, said that he's got concerns with the funding model for charter schools. What do you think is the best way to fund charters moving forward? Is it just about that reliability, or is it about establishing a baseline of funding the same way we've seen with the hold harmless for districts that might see a decline in their student population, but no subsequent decline in funding on the public school side?
I mean, all of the above.
Yes, please.
Yes, please. Please, sir. May I have another?
Okay.
And I think one thing that I would call out in that context is that currently charter students generate foundation aid for their districts. And in particular, in some of those high need student categories, and a lot of charters actually disproportionately enroll the students that currently receive additional funding inside the foundation aid formula, but they don't experience any change or positive or negative based on their student population. So I think if as a state we believe that student needs should be the driver of public funding for education, charter schools should also have that as their funding experience.
Anything else that you think the funding formula should incorporate?
Predictability and equity. And I think both of those are things that I know that districts also want. And so my magic wand would be a revision of the foundation aid formula that would treat charter students like any other public school student.
Well, before we move on, let me reintroduce you for listeners just joining us. This is WCNY's The Capitol Press Room, and we're speaking with Anna Hall, CEO for the New York State Charter Association, which represents more than 350 public charter schools all across New York. Another thing that came up during that budget hearing was this idea of, well, what schools are kids actually attending? And I believe it was you who made the case that in New York City, they do a great job of tracking movement of kids between schools. Outside of New York City, not so much the case, with districts trying to validate a lot of these residences for kids and also where they're attending, and it all adding up to being a lot of work and a big headache. What does that contribute to this idea of maybe not knowing where kids are going? Is it resulting in charter schools either getting money that they shouldn't have or getting denied money that you think they should have?
Well, even before talking about charter schools and the funding impacts on schools, I think it's important to talk about and think about, and I know, for example, the State Education Department is doing work on this, what it means for students, because in particular, low-income students tend to be more transient, and I don't mean transients in the sense of the impact of housing instability. I mean moving more frequently, changing schools more often, things like that. And when there isn't a unified system to know whether or not a student is in school, the student population that is going to be the most impacted by that lack of a system are going to be the most vulnerable students. And so totally aside from, again, any funding implications for charters, I think there's a very real obligation that we should feel to know whether or not kids are in school. And certainly now after COVID, with concerns about things like chronic absenteeism, I'm really concerned that there are students who are not enrolled in any school for chunks of time. And there's not a great way outside of New York City to know that.
And what about that issue about ensuring funds are going where they need to go? Is this challenge of tracking kids resulting in money not ending up where it's supposed to?
So there are really clear statutory requirements in terms of charter schools and districts, and how the funding is supposed to flow. And when everyone's doing everything right, no, I don't think that there is a concern about that. I will say doing everything right can involve a lot of complexity and effort, both for districts and for charter schools, because right now the funding mechanism relies so significantly on districts' payments to charters. So districts care a lot about whether or not they should be paying for this student, or a neighboring district should be paying for the student. The charter, not so much. They know that the student exists, and oftentimes they end up sort of in this no man's land between two districts, both of whom say the student isn't enrolled in their district, but ultimately no one is disputing that the child exists and is attending the charter school.
Well, you mentioned the problem of chronic absenteeism, and I think the most recent state education department numbers put the issue of chronic absenteeism, missing more than 10% of a school year, at above 25% for the 2023-2024 school year. What are you experiencing at your charter schools? Is this a similar problem, or have you figured out a way to beat this issue?
So I think it's definitely a similar problem, although not at that scale. And that is one advantage of many charter schools is a smaller school setting allows them more opportunities to attack issues like chronic absenteeism really at a smaller scale. But definitely the underlying causes, the shifts in parent perception about education and things like that are also issues that charters are struggling with post-COVID.
Another issue I'm interested in from the public charter school perspective compared to the public school perspective is this idea of teacher recruitment and retention, because right now there's a major campaign by the unions at the public schools to sweeten their retirements for the members hired in the last decade and a half. You've got some charters that are part of the teachers' retirement system and some that are not. So this is a great way, I guess, to compare apples and oranges. Are you having recruitment and retention issues? And if you are you seeing any difference based on the availability of those sweet pensions?
So I think every public school right now, and probably also private schools, are struggling with a teacher shortage.
Yeah.
That is a very, very real thing. And so charter schools are, and I'm sure as their district counterparts are as well, trying to think about all of the ways that they can sort of reintroduce and re-inspire people into the teaching profession. And certainly retirement is part of that, although oftentimes the employment population that you're talking about in that context feels like retirement is so far off in their future.
Welcome to the club.
That it's not nearly as important to them as the feeling of being able to make an impact, whether or not you're going to be allowed to wear yoga pants on any given day.
Maybe your starting salary?
Yes, but in many cases, charter schools are competitive with their district counterparts in that context. So it's definitely also a challenge for charters, and some, like you said, choose to offer the teacher retirement system, and others use different mechanisms. But every single charter school offers some aspect of a retirement opportunity.
Well, at the top of our conversation, you mentioned that there's two different ways for approving new charter schools, State Education Department and the SUNY review process. The SUNY chancellor was grilled a little bit about their review process, I think in part because people are mad that so many charters are being approved through their process as opposed to the State Education Department. What's your take on all this?
So I think that the strength of multiple authorizers in a state, especially two statewide authorizers that are nationally renowned for being rigorous, the advantage is that you're going to get really, really great charters. And the New York charter sector is among the strongest in the country, largely, I think, because of both of those state authorizers and the fact that there's two. So there is a little bit of dynamic tension between those two organizations, which I ultimately think is better for kids because it means that folks have to work harder in order to receive a charter, in order to continue to operate a charter. But it definitely can create some dynamic tension between the two organizations.
Probably helps to have an organization whose board isn't made up of people with maybe the closest of ties to the teachers union as well, right?
Well, I think the other thing is that authorizing a charter school is work, and these are both institutions that have plenty of work to do. And oftentimes, I know for any of your listeners right now who are members of the charter schools team, either at SUNY or at SED, they would want me to give a shout out to their very, very hard work and the fact that within their organizations, there's a lot of priorities aside from charter authorizing. And so whether or not charter authorizing is financially prioritized within an organization is also a major input to their ability to do that.
Well, we've been speaking with Anna Hall. She's CEO for the New York State Charter Association. Anna, thank you so much for making the time. Really appreciate it.
My pleasure. Thank you.
And for more Capital Press Room content, visit capitalpressroom.org or wherever you download your favorite podcasts.